Hi everyone, this is Chile Olayanju. I'm so glad to welcome you to this episode where we discuss food safety measures and best practices that have been adopted by food establishments across the country as we reopen. It just basically focuses on helping you to understand what guidelines are being followed to protect consumers and what consumers should do to protect themselves as we reopen restaurants and return to life as we know it, or life as usual, after a prolonged period of lockdown due to the coronavirus pandemic. I have an expert that joined me in this conversation. Actually, this conversation took place a few months ago during a Global Food Health Innovation Summit, which I hosted the summer of 2020. She had very good insights into this topic because it's an area of expertise, and that is Dr. Anabelle Broadbent. I want to invite you to join me in welcoming Dr. Broadbent to this conversation.
Well, hello, Julia. So good to see you.
Good to see you too. So we're going to get started. I'll just allow you to introduce yourself and tell our audience a bit about what you do.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So I am a pathogenic microbiologist by training. That's one of the labels I wear. I also happen to be a food and nutrition scientist. And by training, I am a food safety expert. My background is a bit diverse in that I have done work in government for both the NASA and the USDA. At NASA, I looked at the survival of human pathogens on foods for long duration space missions. At the USDA, I looked at biological controls and at the survival of foodborne pathogens on foods that are minimally processed. I also worked in academia as a food science and microbiology professor. And more recently, I've been working in industry. So that's part of my background. Today, I am the CEO of Verde Ops. Verde is a Spanish word for green. What I do is all things green. So what Verde Ops is an outsourced operations firm. And we're working exclusively with the alternative protein segment of the food industry. Most of the work that we've done in recent months has been with the plant-based segment of the industry. We work both domestically and internationally. And we find ourselves in the intersection of food and physical health. And the food science knowledge that we bring to our clients covers all aspects of food science. So if you can think of food microbiology, especially now with a focus on emerging pathogens, has been a lot of the work that we have been doing, but also food processing, food chemistry, food analysis, nutrition science, and all things food science. And that brings me to our topic today, which is going to be more focused, as you mentioned a few minutes ago, is going to be much more focused on some of those food safety principles and fundamentals during this pandemic, looking at how some of those apply and what are some of the best practices that restaurants and retail food establishments are using.
What are precautions the restaurants are taking? So it would just be good if you could shed some light on what people should have in mind when people on both sides of the equation, whether you own a restaurant or you are a consumer going to restaurants to eat.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll start by saying that as restaurants have been reopening, you're going to see that there's a substantial variation among states. So the answer that I'm going to give you is not a one-size-fits-all answer.
Sure.
So it really depends on where you are. So when you look at geographically, it really depends on whether you are located in a high area of infection versus a low area of infection. And some of the best practices that you see in all these various different restaurants and food establishments reflect that, right? So the first thing I'd like to say is that it's really important that these food establishments partner with their local regulatory and health authorities and discuss the requirements for that particular area, for that particular state. That's really important, so that you know what is required and what the recommendations are. Also keep in mind that the restaurants have been opening in phases. So in the past few months, we've seen a lot of emphasis on delivery of food, on takeout of food, and really no dining in. But what you have been seeing in the last few days and few weeks, depending on which state you're at, is a shift from outdoor eating areas to some indoor eating, and obviously the practices around those have completely changed since before COVID. So be aware of the requirements in terms of food safety establishments. So increased sanitation procedures, that is a requirement for all establishments. The wearing of face masks, you're going to see that. Temperature checks for staff, and the new norm, the social distancing. But how the restaurants and food establishments are going about communicating that is incredibly different depending again on where you're at. So there's some operational changes that are recommended by different states, and I'm going to go over some of the more common trends that we are seeing and sort of highlight some of the key differences in various states. The first one you're going to see is reduced occupancy. So forget the fact that before we used to have packed, restaurants, and the focus was really in keeping those tables moving. So now we have reduced occupancy, and it varies. Like in the state of Indiana, for example, they are open at about 50% reduced capacity. And then if you look at others, they're as low as 25%, reduced capacity. And yet other states are not dictating or defining a specific percentage, but instead are defining occupancy based on the size of the establishment. So again, check what applies in your particular area. Another key trend and common trend now is the reduced party sizes. So no longer are you allowed to have these big parties and have all these people come over and gather to celebrate graduations and birthdays and weddings and so on. Instead, you have several different guidances. For example, the size of the dining parties in the states of Arizona, Arkansas, and Georgia are less than 10 if we are dining indoors. Other states such as Mississippi and New Hampshire is less or equal to 6 individuals. So a bit of variation there as well. The other trend that we've noticed is the prioritizing those to-go orders. So even though some restaurants and some retail food establishments do have open indoors, they're still prioritizing that delivery service, that curbside delivery versus the dining in facilities, even if they have them. Another key trend that we have noticed is the reservations should be required. They're not mandatory, but it certainly helps the restaurants and the food establishments manage the capacity and plan accordingly. So you're seeing that as another key trend. Ordering ahead of time via online or mobile, having contactless payment options are a best practice that is just now being used by everyone. The buffets are gone. In most places, that's not something that you see anymore. In some states, you have language that you see that it's prohibited. Other states have language around, must discontinue the use of salad bars and buffets. And then the other thing that we've seen a lot is the more drive-through lanes. From smaller restaurants that used to have a drive-through that we're not even using simply because that was not part of their services, those drive-throughs have been opened. And for restaurants or facilities or fast food places that had one drive-through lane have now open, additional drive-through lanes. So those are some of the common trends that we have been seeing in the past few weeks and months. And I think what I'd like to point out is that what I expect to happen in terms of next steps in the next few weeks and months is that we're going to see all these establishments implementing and executing all those new policies and procedures, and be open to trial and error, because that's pretty much what's going to happen. We're going to learn what works, what doesn't work, and what new operational changes need to be implemented.
So to people that are guarded and reluctant to venture out, do you have a few thoughts to in terms of safety? Like, okay, well, it's safe, it's kind of safe, it's not safe. What would you like to share with them?
Well, the first thing I'd like to share is I think people are looking to once again going out and enjoying a meal with friends. I think that is a shared responsibility. Some of the things that we talked about today are mostly describing the responsibility of the brands and the restaurants and the food establishments. But the reality is that each individual has to take personal responsibility.
Right.
So you have to observe those social distance guidances. You have to practice good personal hygiene. But I can tell you that consumers are eager to return to restaurants and to eat, and that's good news for all the restaurant owners. I think over the past few months, I have been thinking a lot about nourishment. And so many of us were at home, right? And so many of us were going and looking into, our comfort foods, whether, preparing a meal that reminded us what it was like to eat together, to celebrate, to connect with others. And even when we were planning a grocery trip, looking at those comfort foods or ordering from our favorite restaurants, whether to buy those comfort foods or to show support, I think those things reminded us of the vital role that food plays in our daily habits, in our social lives and our culture. And, this has also been a time that I, along with many others, have been thinking about the relationship of food and physical health. So as we are looking for ways to keep ourselves and our families healthy during a time that there is a renewed, spotlight on understanding what we eat and what food we put in our bodies not only fuels us, sustains us, but also protects us. So what I think and what I see is that as we move past the most acute phases of this crisis, I think the notion that food nourishes us in so many ways, it brings us energy, it brings us joy, nutrients, but it also brings us a sense of connection with others. I think these ideas that both are essential will inform our business and the food industry as we move forward.
People should not allow fear to hold them back, but look forward to connecting with people around food again.
Yeah.
So I'm sure the restaurant industry will be very happy with you for that. I say that. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing with us today. It's been great having you, and I want to say a big thank you to all our audience, everyone that tuned in. Oh, it's a pleasure